Hello, welcome to Afad Podcasts. I am Hala Akay, and today we will discuss a very popular subject, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. We have two guests, Aykan Erdemir, a former member of the Turkish Parliament and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, and Howard Eissenstat, a professor of Middle East history and an resident senior fellow at Project on Middle East Democracy. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So following local elections this year, many started talking about the rise of the opposition in Turkey, saying that the country may return to the path of democratization if Erdoğan somehow loses his seat. On the other hand, Turkey has witnessed a serious system change since 2016, and we also talk about collapsing institutions and a failing state. So is it realistic to assume that Turkey can rapidly reverse all those changes that have happened under Erdoğan's rule if power changes hands?
Shall I start as a former member of the Turkish opposition?
Please.
I would say that the local elections have proven that there is robust opposition in Turkey. Not only there are multiple resilient opposition parties, but also against all odds, they managed to form coalitions to push back against Erdoğan's one-man rule and authoritarianism. This means that Turkish democracy still has some life in it. But at the same time, I think it would be naive to ignore the damage Erdoğan's one-man rule has done to Turkey's institutions, separation of powers, and checks and balances, as well as rule of law and due process. In the absence of a level playing field, in the absence of any semblance of inclusive institutions and rule of law, the simple fact of winning elections will not suffice to reverse Turkey's descent into authoritarianism. I think it's easier to envision an opposition victory, whether at the local elections, whether at the parliamentary elections, or at the presidential elections, than a meaningful transformation overnight back into a liberal democratic polity. Hence, Turkey's transition in the post-Erdoğan era, no matter when that might come, will be a long and painful one, which will not only be about transfer of political power, but it will also be about a long, painful rebuilding of inclusive institutions, rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances. And we know that that is not an easy to-do list for Turkey or for any other country.
So I basically agree with everything Aykan said, though maybe I'm inclined to be a little bit more pessimistic about it. I think that it's fair to start out with the point that Turkey wasn't fully a liberal democracy before 2002, and that Erdoğan's success as an electoral authoritarian has been by finding the institutional weaknesses that were already evident in the system and capitalizing on them. And in fact, widening them and widening the institutional weakness. I think that the municipal elections were clearly an indicator of the limitations of Erdogan's success, and certainly Turkey remains effectively a 50-50 country. But it's not clear to me that the opposition's unity in municipal elections in Istanbul and Ankara is going to necessarily translate to oppositional unity in a national election. It's certainly clear that Erdogan took from the municipal elections lessons, and national elections are quite far away. I think that there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of early elections in Turkey. I don't actually see much gain for Erdogan in having early elections, and as Aykan very accurately noted, he has the advantage of controlling institutions, and that control continues. He continues to create greater control over the Supreme Electoral Commission, over the judiciary, and those things carry on. And so while I think that the municipal elections quite rightly demonstrate the continued desire for democracy in Turkey, and I think that remains true, and it remains true across a very wide spectrum of Turkish population. I don't think that necessarily translates into actual democracy.
Mm-hmm. So that's only a theory, but Erdogan has consolidated so much power in his hands that after him, we will likely see a vacuum in Turkish politics, and multiple actors like new parties, opposition parties, old guards, some new guards will rush to fill in, and we will be left with a public sector that has worked with Erdogan and in fact has cooperated in his policies. So what will happen in Turkish politics, in your opinion, after Erdogan?
Now, in the political playing field, I doubt that there will be a vacuum in two different senses of the term. When it comes to the opposition playing field, we see robust players from the right to the left, from the pro-Kurdish side of the spectrum to the Turkish nationalist end of the spectrum. And within the AKP, or within the AKP playing field, we see still notables within the party as well as splinter parties coming out of that movement. So overall, the political spectrum has enough channels to mobilize interest groups and articulate their policy, rhetoric and vision. What's, I think, more problematic is the vacuum that will result from the sudden absence of a one-man ruler who has usurped a lot of the executive, legislative, and judicial prerogatives. That will require subsidiarity, as those powers grasped by Erdogan will need to gradually be transferred back to their rightful owner institutions. And that, of course, again, I will call it a painful and long process. And the reason being, it's easier to dismantle institutions. It's easier to usurp powers than to rebuild institutions, than to share powers back with other institutions. And we shouldn't, I think, fool ourselves into thinking that once Erdogan is gone, this would be a one-way street, because there will be enough vested interests in these organizations, enough Erdogan loyalists who will resist by any means possible these attempts to open the system up, these attempts to decentralize and kind of deregulate and hyper-centralize systems. So I think that could be the defining characteristic of a post-Erdogan era, as a new ruling bloc attempts to reshuffle power, both executive power as well as legislative and judicial power, and reshuffle the bureaucracy they might meet stiff resistance from both Erdogan loyalists as well as others who share his authoritarian vision and who hold on to these kind of bastions of power within the military and civilian bureaucracy.
Thank you. Mr. Eissenstat?
So I fundamentally agree with Aykan, but at the core of the question is a premise that Erdogan's leaving, and so we have to imagine he's what, I think 65 years old. He could potentially leave, though I don't actually think it very likely. He could leave through elections in 2023. He could leave through elections in 2020. So that would bring him up to, assuming he doesn't, that goes to 2028. We're moving pretty far into the future to sort of conjecture. And barring ill health, I think that we're looking at a good long Erdogan era. But let's for the purposes of conversation, let's imagine he disappears. He goes into occultation or whatever, and we're talking about a post-Erdogan age. I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I think that core belief in democracy is still there, and I think that although he has tremendous control over basic institutions, I'm not sure that that tremendous control translates into a post-Erdogan era very easily. In other words, are Erdogan loyalists in the security services or the judiciary going to continue to be loyal should that system of controls and rent get disrupted? I don't know the answer to that, and I think the minor disruptions that we've seen in the judiciary since the municipal elections suggest that as weak as those institutions have been facing down a strongman, that if they believe that there's sort of opportunity to become more independent, they may well do so. The other side of that, though, is and here I think I'm more closely aligned to Aykan, is that the business interests that have surrounded Erdogan remain in place and have accumulated a tremendous amount of power. They have their relationship to AKP dominance is still intact, and they're going to do everything they can to maintain those relations post Erdogan. So I mean, I guess I agree with Aykan that the institutions have been fundamentally weakened, and rebuilding them is not going to be easy. I'm not sure that Erdogan has actually created a system or a network that survives him easily. And so if we're conjecturing about what a post-Erdogan era looks like, I think a lot depends on how strong those networks prove to be. My sense is that they're not quite as strong as they should be.
I would like to follow up on one important point Howard raised, and that is the new business interests. And I think what he was referring to is this inner circle of cronies who have accumulated enormous wealth and access to these mega projects, especially within the last decade. And I think that is a very crucial part of this equation because in the post-Erdogan era, the party itself, the AKP itself, might have a difficulty in routinizing Erdogan's charisma in the Weberian sense, but these business interests will have a strong incentive to do so. And what I mean by that is, unlike earlier cronies in Turkey who benefited from the spoils, but who could nevertheless survive without spoils. This new crony regime is one where their vested interest is also a risky one. That is, unless they have these revenue guarantees, unless they have these huge lending streams from state banks, and unless they continue to tap into these fundamentally corrupt tenders, these mega projects, these companies cannot survive. These corporations cannot survive. Hence, they will do whatever is in their hands to sustain Erdoganism beyond Erdogan. And this, we have seen kind of a sneak preview of this in the aftermath of the March elections. For example, they have used the media they control. They have used the Pelican troll farms and conspiracy networks they have, trying to undermine elections and pushed for the rerun in Istanbul. Hence, they will have a much stronger incentive to do that, to repeat that at the national level, at the parliamentary elections level, at the presidential elections level, because they cannot let go. They don't have any exit strategy, just like Erdogan and his family have no exit strategy. So I think Turkey's tragedy is the alliance of two factions with no exit strategies. The Erdogan clan has no political exit strategy, and the Erdogan cronies have no economic exit strategy, and they are bound in this kind of Catholic wedding, which will require them to sustain the regime beyond its charismatic leader, Erdogan.
So you make a great point. Here's the thing that one of the things I took from the municipal elections, and particularly the rerun of the election, was that it really was quite dumb, and I think that's actually a really important thing to consider, that Erdogan accepted the lobbying within his party for a rerun of the elections, and then failed to cement either a strategy or a rigging that would result in a favorable outcome, which speaks to potentially the limitations of his willingness or capacity to manipulate institutions, and brings into question the basic competence of the machine. And, I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but I think that we've been running on the assumption that that they're going, because they have a vested interest in X occurring, that they'll have the wit and the will to get to put into place strategies that will get them to that point. And the municipal elections, and particularly the Istanbul rerun, have made me question whether that basic competence is really there.
I agree.
Okay, then let's pass to foreign policy, because many also have been saying that Turkey has been drifting away from the West, getting closer with Russia. And this change has also been attributed mainly to Erdogan, but is he the only one that favors reshuffling Turkey's alliances? I mean, apart from the pro-Kurdish HDP, our opposition parties have different opinions about foreign policy, and what may happen in foreign policy after Erdogan?
So let me start by stating the obvious. That is, in public opinion polls, we have always seen a strong dose of anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism in Turkey over the years, if not decades. We have also seen a similar skepticism concerning all Western partners. And we have seen over the decades that the average Turkish citizen says, Turk has no friend but Turk. But despite this apparent isolationism or anti-Westernism, Turkish foreign policy has managed to, steer in different directions. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, meaning despite this kind of base level of isolationism and anti-Westernism, Turkey has managed to develop, relatively positive win-win relations with NATO, has managed to turn toward the European Union, has become an accession country, has carried out significant EU harmonization reforms. So basically, although there's this underlying kind of xenophobic sentiment, it doesn't necessarily mean that Turkey will have to stay on the current trajectory, drifting more and more towards, Russia and other authoritarian regimes in the East. So I am optimistic in the sense that Turkish domestic and foreign policy over the decades has been very flexible. That, the Turkish public is known for quite significant U-turns, given if there is a leadership to steer that public opinion. But at the same time, I am cautious, so I'm cautiously optimistic, and my caution comes from the fact that we should not underestimate both the global transformation towards greater illiberalism, authoritarianism, isolationism, and anti-transatlanticism, winds which will also affect Turkey. But also, we shouldn't underestimate the ongoing social engineering in Turkey. We're talking about a generation or two exposed to the most kind of the vile of conspiracy theories, kind of Islamist propaganda, xenophobia, ultranationalism, and this will take a toll, meaning I think there has been some fundamental shift in the average Turkish citizen's thinking about foreign and security policy. And a number of phobias has become quite central to that thinking. So this is then, in the most optimistic of cases, this will have to be, again, a long and painful recovery path, because Turkey's return, if at all, back to the transatlantic alliance and its values, back to the European Union, back to kind of the Western liberal world order, if it is still there to return to, will have to be not only at the bilateral and multilateral level, through kind of rebuilding of bridges and ties with allies, but also through what might be called, for the lack of a better term, a reverse social engineering. I'm not advocating social engineering here, but it is a process of unlearning hate and prejudice and xenophobia and isolationism and anti-Westernism, which is easier said than done. Again, part of my cautious optimism, and I emphasize the caution part there, stems from the fact that most of Turkey's transatlanticists, most of Turkey's believers in Turkey's continued engagement with the West are what I call closet transatlanticists. And they refuse to come out of the closet. They refuse to articulate a transatlanticist position. They refuse to take risks defending NATO, European Union, Council of Europe, OECD and the Bretton Woods institutions. So in conclusion, Turkey needs those brave transatlanticists to come out of the closet, to articulate a new set of foreign and security policy options, which will rebuild bridges severed with NATO, with the European Union, with the Council of Europe, with the OECD and Bretton Woods institutions. And I know this is no easy task, given how counter-cyclical this would be, given how around the world we see the rise of isolationism and xenophobia and kind of anti-globalization, both on the right and the left. But I think this is the hard task that lays ahead of Turkey's public intellectuals and policymakers.
Okay.
So I'm glad we finally had a chance to disagree, Aykan. I think these sorts of discussions are kind of boring when we're all on the same page, as we've been through most of the conversation. So I think that I think first of all, I'm not sure that Turkey is more nationalist now than it was 20 years ago. I think nationalism and racism have been very strong currents within Turkish identity, national conversations for as long as I've been studying Turkey, certainly. I don't, but moreover, I'm not sure that it matters very much. I'm not sure that domestic opinion has been a major motor for Turkish foreign policy outside of the Erdoğan era, where it was clearly where he's clearly instrumentalized it at moments for political gain. I think that if we're thinking about Turkish foreign policy in the future, we have to distinguish between those things that are structural and part of Turkish foreign policy, regardless of who is leader, and those things that are specific to Erdoğan's governance. And I think that there is a lot that's specific to Erdoğan. I think that he has been very ideological in the way he's responded to Venezuela, the way he has engaged with Palestine and the support of Hamas. These are things that I'm not sure another Turkish government would have done. I think for better and for worse, he has his policy on Syria and the Syrian civil war was very distinctive to him, and I think it was heartfelt. I think if we look at Turkey's engagement in Libya or in Sudan, those are things that seem to come out of Erdoğan himself. That said, I think that there's an awful lot that is would be true for any Turkish government. I think that one with the failure of the Annan plan for Cyprus and the entrance of Cyprus into the EU, I think that EU membership was fundamentally off the table, and that a renegotiation of EU-Turkish relations was inevitable. I think, given the trajectory of the United States and the commitment of both the Obama administration and the Trump administration to remove themselves from the Middle East, or to de-escalate the Middle East in their foreign policy, coupled with the failures of the U.S. and Iraq, I think it was inevitable that Turkey start to look elsewhere to develop a broader set of relations in the region. I think, in a sense, the desire to create a broader sense of relations in the region, to engage with Iran, to engage with Russia. I think those things were inevitable. I think that Erdogan has doubled down on them in some ways because he sees them as ideologically comforting, but I don't think that those are intrinsically from Erdogan. So, you know, I think that in a sense, the breakdown of U.S.-Turkish relations it has some stuff to do with anti-Westernism and Erdogan, but I think that breakdown of relations was, in a sense, a function of Turkey's greater ambitions and the United States' lowered capacities. In contrast, I think Turkey's relations with the EU are much more important and much more interesting. I think that those tensions in a post-Erdogan era would likely improve. I don't think that I think that membership is off the table, but I think that some sort of customs union might play a role, and I think that the EU could potentially once again play a positive role in Turkey's democratization by leveraging support with development of institutional independence and rights expressions, as they did in the 1990s with EU accession. But I think that EU accession itself is off the table. So where I think we disagree is I think that for you, the core of what's going on is ideological. And in my reading, the core is structural. So I think that the ideological shifts are important, but I think they're very tied to Erdogan, because I'm not sure that public opinion necessarily plays that big a role in foreign policy overall. I think that structurally the U.S. and Turkey are going to drift away, because I don't think that Turkey needs the U.S. that much. And I think that American capacities, in a relative sense, have declined and will continue to decline. There are simply more players on the field. I can imagine, though, that in a so structurally, I think these the trends are going to continue, but I think that potentially EU-Turkish relations can improve, and really that's the much more important one, economically and politically, for Turkey's future. The United States has had a military and strategic relationship with Turkey, but EU-Turkish relations are deeper, they're broader, they're much there's a lot more going on, and so if we're talking about a post-Erdogan era, and again, I don't see that coming anytime soon, I can imagine at that level Turkey's relations going closer to what we think of as a pre-Erdogan norm of emphasizing the EU, and that I think would be good for Turkey and the EU.
Of course, there is one elephant in the room, and it's literally not an elephant, but a bear, and that's the Russian bear. And, as the proverbial joke goes, you can invite a bear to dance, but the bear decides when the dance will end. And so Turkey's ongoing relationship with Russia will continue to pose a major structural constraint as to what successive Turkish governments will be able to do. And hence, whether it's center-right or center-left, whether it's pro-Kurdish or Turkish nationalist coalitions that rule Turkey in the decades to come, if they want to wean themselves of Russian influence and control, a legacy of the Erdogan era, they will inevitably need partners to counter Russian influence. And for the time being, I cannot think of any other partners that matter beyond the European Union and the United States. So just like in the late 1940s, early 1950s, Turkey might again be in a pragmatic need for the United States, for the transatlantic alliance, not necessarily for the values they share, but simply to push back against the growing Russian influence, hegemony, not only in Turkey, but in the Middle East. I do understand that a post-Brexit EU will have, little capacity or appetite for such counterbalancing. I understand an increasingly isolationist United States, post-Trump United States might not necessarily have the same weight it used to have during the Cold War, but nevertheless, for Turkey's future leaders who might have an interest in, establishing a more, let's say, a balanced set of relations with Russia, they might see the European Union and the United States yet again as an important pragmatic partner in making that possible. And hence, if that plays a central role in future Turkish foreign policy, this might be the new pragmatic grounds on which Turkey's relations with the West can be rebuilt.
And may I just ask one more thing? So if we are talking about elephants in the room, Kurdish issue is also another elephant in the room, and it is so much at the center of Turkey's foreign policies. So when you talk about those potential future relations with the United States and the European Union, what do you expect that what will happen around the Kurdish issue?
Howard, why don't you take this question so that I can have the pleasure of agreeing or disagreeing with you?
I think that support for the Kurds in the West is a mile wide and an inch thick. I don't think that it's long term. I think that yes, if you ask of public opinion, or you talk about sort of in people's hearts, what do they think? There's warm feelings for the Kurds, but in the end, I don't think that those determine foreign policy in either Europe or the United States, except for in those European countries where Kurdish issues impact domestic politics. Which is to say, I think that moving forward, at some point, Syria is going to be further stabilized. I think that the Kurdish issue stops becoming a foreign policy issue for Turkey and once again becomes primarily a domestic policy issue. And I don't. I think the calculations there are fundamentally the same. I think that Turkish governments since the mid-90s have been attempting to address Kurdish concerns through an array of economic development projects and acquiescing to Kurdish identity symbols, Kurdish language broadcasts, things like that. The AKP did that as well. But I think that there have been red lines for Turkish governments, both under the AKP and after the AKP, about sort of centralized control, and I don't see those going away. Which is to say, I think that the Kurdish issue will remain a big problem domestically, a big question domestically. I don't think it will ever I don't think it's likely to be resolved in the foreseeable future, regardless of who's governing Turkey. But I don't see it necessarily continuing to have the primacy that it has in foreign policy the way it does now.
And Howard, thank you for doing the heavy lifting. And let me just add, a few cents of my own. And I think the Kurdish issue has been one of the main drivers of what I consider to be irrationality and self-destructive foreign and security policy making in Turkey. And hence, if in the post-Erdoğan era, if we have a broad-based coalition similar to the one that brought İmamoğlu and other CHP mayors to power in Turkey in the last round of local elections, that is a broad-based coalition inclusive of Turkey's pro-Kurdish HDP, then we might have a corrective to Turkish foreign and security policy. And what I'm trying to say is, if a successive Turkish government or governments manage to overcome their phobia of Kurdish rights and decentralization, not only in Turkey, but also in Iraq and in Syria, this could be an opportunity to reshape Turkish foreign policy beyond the immediate and irrational needs to crush Kurdish political and cultural ambitions of any sort wherever they are detected. And that Turkey, I know that's an extremely optimistic expectation, but if that Turkey materializes, as we have seen in the local elections, then we might see, and if that is combined with visionary leadership, we might see a new Turkey that is not bound by received shackles of the past. We might see a Turkey that's just like the way in which it established win-win relationships with the Kurdistan regional government, can start establishing such win-win relations with Kurds and others within and outside its borders, return to a robust trade diplomacy, return to a less securitized way of approaching foreign and security policy, transition from a state security-centric way of approaching security to a comprehensive security approach. And I know these are really fantasies at this moment, but I guess if we don't have dreams as to the future of Turkish foreign security and domestic policy, then I think there are too many structural factors which can push us into the depths of pessimism. So let me end with Antonio Gramsci's quote: "The pessimism of the mind and the optimism of the will. So if there is a will, there might be a way."
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
And we'll leave the last word to Gramsci.
And thanks everyone for listening us. Goodbye.